I was a big fan of Tiger back in the day, which sounds kinda dumb to say as an adult. I was a Dark Knight/Dragon Knight main, as my regular viewers might already know. October 11th, 2007, the end of an era. Tiger has been dethroned. FangBlade has secured rank 1. For the first time in the history of the game, Tiger falls below number 1.
What makes something iconic? What can take a class in an MMO like MapleStory and turn it into an icon? Dark Knight might be the most iconic class in all of old-school MapleStory. The legacy this class left behind is unlike any we've ever seen. Dark Knight was the class of choice for players like Tiger and FangBlade, who both dominated the rankings in old-school MapleStory. The shift from 3rd job to 4th job for this class changed their identity entirely, though most of its legacy was already committed to the history books by the time this shift happened. Dark Knights certainly had their weaknesses, and some were difficult to overlook. Despite these shortcomings, this class is widely respected. A huge number of highly regarded players throughout the game's history have mained it, and its story is quite interesting. It's easily my favorite of all the classes we see in OSMS, and I'm not the only one who feels that way. So, what is Dark Knight's legacy?
Welcome, the darkness.
In September 2004, MapleStory Global's beta was launched. It came after the release of the first version of the game in Korea in 2002. We were already well behind where KMS was, and while they were actively developing 3rd Job, we were just learning about MapleStory in the West. This is Togain. Today, we're telling my story, though I didn't actually play during the beta. Either way, there was only so much to do during this era. Luckily, a warrior wouldn't struggle to reach level 10, as strength was their main stat and they required a minimum of 35 to get their first job advancement. The more strength a warrior has, the better, though some enemies like orange mushrooms might be difficult to take down without enough accuracy. After reaching level 10, a warrior can get their job advancement from dances with Balrog, and now we get our first look at the skills a swordsman gains access to. A 1st job Dark Knight is known as a swordsman. As far as 1st jobs go, this class shares some similarities with magicians, surprisingly, though they did have one tool that separates them from every other 1st job class, at least until the release of pirates. Just like we see with magicians, a swordsman's first skill is improved HP recovery. Unlike the magician version of this skill, though, it doesn't have as significant of an impact on a character's wallet. It required the player to be standing still for 10 seconds to even begin recovering HP in the first place, so this skill only had a small impact overall. To the contrary, improved max HP increase was a mandatory pickup with huge implications for a swordsman. It increases HP gained every level, as well as when an ability point is added directly to HP. This increase in HP is substantial too. I remember reaching over 1000 max HP by the time I was level 25 and thinking even that was insane, but it's actually very easy for a swordsman to reach this HP threshold a few levels earlier than that if they max this skill before anything else. Endure is a skill we've actually seen before on Assassin. Unlike the Assassin version, the 1st job Warrior version only adds the ability to recover HP while hanging on a ladder or rope. The additional HP and MP recovery we see in the Assassin version is not present in this version of the skill, instead being relegated to improved HP recovery. Iron Body is a skill that is easily overlooked. It's a nice increase in defense, but without any scaling properties, it becomes useless eventually. This doesn't mean it's not good to have, but it requires 20 skill points to max, and that's a large investment for something that won't be used for very long. Power Strike is the next skill on the list. It's pretty straightforward. Use MP to deal higher damage than you would with a regular attack. Interestingly, it works with every type of weapon in the game, something that the developers decided wasn't important since weapon types were so heavily restricted. Even though Power Strike can be used with a crossbow, it's not like there were any crossbows that a warrior was allowed to equip in the first place. Slash Blast has the same properties, being usable with any weapon type, but it's a very different kind of skill. Slash Blast will consume both MP and HP to swing a weapon with increased damage that hits up to 6 enemies. This is primarily what separates first job swordsmen from every other class in the game at this point. No other class is capable of hitting multiple monsters at once in first job, and this gives swordsmen a nice advantage in terms of leveling speed. Unlike what we find with magicians, a swordsman can easily afford to begin leveling max HP increase after getting the prerequisite 5 points in HP recovery. Their innate base damage was high enough with their strength that they could get by just swinging at things with the standard attack and not have to worry about getting an early value point in Power Strike. After this, it's just a matter of leveling Slash Blast and then Power Strike until they're maxed. A swordsman's skill build is actually quite straightforward, even more straightforward than other first job classes, which is quite the feat considering how simple these jobs can be. One of the biggest issues any warrior will often run into is a lack of accuracy. This is the greatest weakness of any warrior. If they don't have the accuracy to hit the enemy, their DPS is 0 regardless of their strength. The formula that calculates accuracy has a direct correlation to character level. When the player is the same level as the enemy they're trying to hit, the amount of accuracy they need to hit the monster 100% of the time reaches its lowest value, and it will never drop below that. If a player is lower level than the enemy, they're going to require more accuracy. Accuracy on a swordsman is a bit complex, and it's something that they all have to deal with for a very long time. Warrior is the first job we've covered who doesn't rely on their secondary stat, even officially. Warrior gear almost never requires dex, just strength, so there's very little incentive to add any points to dex unless we consider accuracy. For every point of dex that a character has, they'll receive 0.8 accuracy, which is not quite a 1-to-1 ratio. This means that accuracy is more valuable than dex, though dex does increase a warrior's minimum damage slightly. If you were to go pure dex on a warrior, you'd find that you do deal some damage, just not nearly as much as you would with a traditional build. The biggest consideration for gear on a warrior always comes down to the amount of dex and accuracy that that piece of gear provides. Without getting too specific, it was usually a safe generalization to prioritize accuracy and dex over strength on gear until the warrior had the accuracy needed to hit the enemies they wanted to hit. Both spears and polearms had scrolls that increased accuracy and also gave a small amount of weapon attack. It wasn't uncommon to find warriors using accuracy increasing gloves over weapon attack gloves if they're struggling to hit with 100% accuracy, since, again, a miss is 0 damage. Weapon choice in first job is weird for all warriors. One has to decide between a little bit of added attacking range with a spear or polearm versus a fast attacking one-handed mace. Weapons in OSMS all have different multipliers that impact the damage they deal. For the most part, and especially in first job, this isn't a consideration that matters all that much. Nobody has mastery over their weapons yet, so the damage isn't going to be good regardless. In my experience, I tend to prefer the fast attack speed one-handed maces for first job. The attacking range from spears is nice, but they're slow, and without mastery, there's no obligation to use them. The one exception to this is the fish spear, the level 20 common spear. Spears range in attacking speed all the way from 5 to 8, with each increasing number resulting in a slower attack speed. Fish spears are near the lower end of this range, possessing 6 attack speed, and they come with extra accuracy and movement speed, which are both very valuable stats on a swordsman. I would use this over just about anything else in first job. Training in first job for a swordsman is a learning process of discovering what your limits are. Monsters like green mushrooms, junior neckies, dark axe stumps, these are all going to be difficult for a spearman to hit until much later on, and it can be frustrating to run into monsters who avoid your attacks constantly. Another struggle swordsmen run into is the fact that they're a melee class. When you have to place yourself right next to the enemy to attack them, you run a higher risk of getting hit. This is one of the reasons why magicians can accumulate so many mesos by the end of first job. Swordsmen, on the other hand, can easily become the poorest. Armor and defense matters a lot more for a swordsman in first job, and it's often a good investment to buy the highest level armor available. You won't need dex to equip it anyway. Hinnis' Hunting Ground, Slime Tree, the Pig Beach. First job training maps are not a science. It comes down to training where you'll take the least amount of damage and save the most mesos. This is an era where everyone was broke, except for hackers, and you couldn't just spam the Orbis exchange quest to reach level 30 because it didn't exist yet. A first job training location I often prefer is West Rocky Mountain 1, found to the west of Parion. It has primarily red snails and normal stumps, which are great low avoidability monsters to train on in the early levels. Eventually, the bubblings at the end of Shumi's first jump quest make for a decent training spot for the one first job class who can actually mob. However, bubblings are known for their insanely high avoidability that restricts swordsmen very heavily until the mid-20s. They drop the fish spear, but by this level range, the ant tunnel maps are also a solid option, and the drops available from those mobs are far more valuable in terms of mesos. KPQ does become an option as well, and it's best avoided until roughly this same level range, as the accuracy needed to hit the ligators in stage 1 is difficult to achieve for a while without high base dex. And this consideration of how much dex to have is something us warriors would be acutely aware of. There were a few cookie-cutter builds back in the day, usually either 4 dex, 20 to 40 dex, or anything above that. These were often referred to as dexless, low dex, and high dex. While similar in concept to a dexless assassin, the considerations are slightly different. The higher the dex, the higher a warrior's accuracy and minimum damage, but the lower their max damage. As time went on and the game was updated, dex became less and less important since newer items were introduced that contributed to a swordsman's accuracy. By the end of the pre-Big Bang era, most Dark Knights were completely dexless without any issues at all, but they had access to some amazing gear that would increase their accuracy substantially. Stat builds for a future Dark Knight really just come down to how much access they have to this accuracy increasing gear. With AP resets, it wasn't the worst thing in the world to go for a high dex build for a while and then slowly reset all of that dex into strength as you upgraded your gear and leveled up. After dying at Over the Wall about a dozen times, I finally reached level 30 and went back to Dances with Balrog to get my second job advancement. The lupins and fire boars I had to take down to get the 30 dark marbles proved to be a bit of a challenge with my limited accuracy. Just like magicians, swordsmen can choose 3 different paths, and I chose the path of the spearman. First on the list of skills is Spear and Polearm Mastery. I'm combining these 2 skills since they're literally the exact same thing and they just apply to different weapon types. These are the mastery skills that a spearman receives. All warriors are given mastery over 2 types of weapons, with one usually being objectively better than the other, but in a spearman's case, the 2 weapons they're given mastery over are actually both useful. Mastery in general is considered incredibly useful for all warriors since it passively gives much needed accuracy. We also find that Final Attack is duplicated for both weapon types. Final Attack is a passive skill that procs an extra attack at a set chance when using a skill. Normal attacks won't trigger it, and the respective Final Attack skill will only work with its specific weapon type. Boosters will increase a specific type of weapon's attack speed by 2 levels for up to 200 seconds. Since both spears and polearms are so notoriously slow, this skill is a very welcome and important addition to a spearman's kit. Now we finally have the first skill that doesn't need to be duplicated to apply to both types of weapons. Iron Will is a lot like First Job's Iron Body, but it applies to the whole party. It's not amazing. And now we get to the skill that every squishy class wanted. The skill that, for better or worse, defined spearmen. Hyper Body is a party buff that increases max HP and MP by 60%. Yes, 60%. It's a huge increase in survivability for most classes, and it was often the determining factor for whether they could actually participate in a boss run without being one-shot. There are essentially two paths that can be taken for a spearman, and one is far superior. The first of these two options is to max out all of the skills for a specific weapon type. Whether that be spears or polearms, it doesn't matter. You'll just max the skills for the weapon you want to use, then max Hyper Body, and finally finish off Iron Will. This is the obvious path. Seeing all these skills placed in front of you, knowing you only have until level 70 to max them, your first thought might be, well, I had better choose a weapon type and stick with it, which is perfectly logical, but it's not efficient. I said before that both spears and polearms were useful for a spearman. This isn't actually true until 3rd job, but it's something that would need to be prepared for in 2nd job. Let me introduce you to the concept of a hybrid spearman. By skipping final attack and only putting the 3 required points into Iron Will to unlock Hyper Body, a spearman is actually capable of maxing Mastery and Booster for both weapon types. In 2nd job, a total of 121 skill points are received. This means all spear skills except for final attack can be maxed while retaining 30 skill points for Hyper Body. 48 skill points remain, which is more than enough to max both Polearm Mastery and Polearm Booster. You'd actually have some points left over. This hybrid build requires skipping final attack, but that's not exactly a loss. Final attack will proc at a set success rate every time a skill is used, either Slash Blast or Power Strike in this case. These two are the main attacking skills in 2nd job for all warriors. Slash Blast can hit up to 6 monsters, and the calculation for final attack's damage uses the number of monsters hit as an ordinal number used to divide the amount of damage dealt to each specific monster, which decreases in value as the number of monsters hit increases. What this means is that final attack, when procced by Slash Blast, will deal less damage per monster than the original Slash Blast attack. It's not uncommon to see the damage divided by final attack resulting in the spearman hitting a 1 on the 6th monster, even if they can hit far higher than that normally. On the flip side, final attack does increase DPS for Power Strike, since final attack has a set animation speed that is faster than Power Strike itself. Ultimately, this is not a trade-off worth making, especially for a spearman. Final attack will not only eat up the points that can be used to build a hybrid spearman, but it also harms the spearman's grinding capabilities greatly. As cool as final attack is, it's kind of useless in this initial form. Eventually, post-Big Bang, final attack would be changed to no longer have any kind of animation, effectively making it a passive that just adds a little bit of DPS. We won't see the benefits of a hybrid build until 3rd job, but it's definitely, without a doubt, the best route for a spearman. With spearmen having access to both spears and polearms, they would have a number of options to choose from when it came to weapon choice. The difference between a spear and a polearm is their swing and stab multiplier. This is one of the many calculations that go into determining damage, so I'll simplify it like I often do with these formulas. When a spear stabs, it has a 100% multiplier. When a spear swings, it has a 60% multiplier, and the inverse is true for polearms. In old school MapleStory, stabs and swings were determined randomly at a 40-60 ratio whenever a player attacked with either of these weapons. For a 2nd job, this makes polearms the superior choice since you'll be swinging more often than stabbing. Keep this in mind for the future, as it will become very important, and it will eventually explain the motivation behind the hybrid build. With accuracy still being the largest determining factor for a spearman, it wasn't uncommon to find them grinding at wild boars and fire boars for quite a while. Both of these mob types had very quick movement speed, which could be considered a con in some cases, but for spearmen who lacked mobility and had a substantial amount of defense by this point, fast-moving small enemies would actually be moderately helpful. Wild boars were capable of dropping the Nakamaki, the level 35 spear that was otherwise only obtainable as a drop from zombie mushrooms. This weapon could not be purchased from any shops until it was added to Elnath's weapon shop in the full release. Fire boars weren't very interesting as far as their drop table goes, but they were capable of dropping Arwen's glass shoes that could be turned in to receive either a piece of ice or a fairy's wing. These two items were used in various recipes to create staves and wands through Francois in Alinea. Not particularly helpful for a spearman, but they were valuable items if the player was lucky enough to get this exceptionally rare drop from fire boars. By the mid-40s, copper drakes were a viable option for spearmen now that they could finally hit them. It wasn't a huge step up in terms of drops, though the Dark Crusader chainmail drop was nice. The big ticket item from Copper Drakes was the Blue Bone Helm. This was the only monster in the game who could drop this item at this point, and it gave a bit of dex, which was obviously helpful for a spearman's accuracy. It wasn't the best option for increasing accuracy, but it was one of the coolest options. Copper Drakes are the lowest tier of Drake enemies, but they still drop dragon skins, an extremely valuable crafting item used in high-level recipes for various gloves and shoes. By the 50s, a spearman could move on to the regular drakes, the older brother to the copper drakes, and these monsters could drop the level 50 Umber Shoulder Mail set. But they had one specific drop that was much more important overall: Drake's Blood. This is a buff potion that increases weapon attack by 8 for 5 minutes. It was the best weapon attack buff potion in the early days, and it dropped exclusively from drakes. By the early to mid-60s, spearmen could move on to red drakes, but this wasn't their only option. In fact, by the time they're training at drakes, they could instead head to golems in the temple maps located in Hinnesis. And once it was released in the future, Forest of Golem, which was heaven for warriors. Normal golems could drop the level 60 Green Ice Queen armor set, which increased dex and accuracy, making it one of the better options for endgame armor, but they didn't offer much else. This talk about armor sets brings me to a discussion about overalls versus tops and bottoms for a spearman. Between the various scrolls that were available and eventually released, tops had scrolls for increasing their strength, and bottoms had scrolls for increasing their dex. Overalls, however, had scrolls for increasing any of the 4 basic stats. When accuracy is no longer a consideration for a spearman, the only stat they require is strength, and an overall has 10 slots versus a top's 7 slots. Ultimately, a well-scrolled overall is the best in slot option, but it was highly dependent on other pieces of gear and overall accuracy, as most things were for a spearman. By the mid-60s, early 70s, spearmen were capable of training at the Sleepywood dungeon on the various monsters, but the best option were the Toro spears without any doubt. These were the highest level monsters available in the beta, and they held both the best in slot spear and polearm drops on their drop table, the Holy Spear and the Skylar. Their younger brothers, the Toro Macy's, could drop the level 50 Serpent's Tongue and the 9 Dragons, as well as 60% spear and polearm attack scrolls. Spearmen were eating good when it came to endgame training areas in the beta, as long as they had the accuracy to hit the monsters. There was no crafting required, there was no worry of survivability with the presence of Hyperbody. By the end of second job, spearmen were starting to show their dominance as a powerful, unkillable class whose only weaknesses were their accuracy and mobility, 2 things that could be overcome with enough time, resources, and buffs. But that was it for the beta. At this point, Nexon officially launched GMS and wiped all the progress obtained in the beta era. Everyone was reset to 0 and the journey began again, this time permanently. We received Orbis and Elnath with the full release, 2 iconic areas that would hold a massive amount of content for a class as powerful as a spearman. Early second job received the Junior Kitty mobs, a fantastic alternative to wild boars and fire boars. The Junior Lioners even came with the Silver Fitted Male drop, a level 35 overall for female warriors that gave dex. Elnath's weapon and armor shop sold some of the more difficult to obtain weapons for an early second job spearman that were previously only craftable or dropped by mobs, not to mention the addition of the 7-slot red snowshoes that instantly became the new best in slot option for just about every class, including spearmen. Scrolling shoes for a spearman was interesting. There were two options: scrolls for shoes for dex and scrolls for shoes for jump. As we know, dex only gives 0.8 accuracy per point of dex. This is always rounded down, so if the player had enough dex for an increase of 16.8 accuracy, they'd only ever get to 16. Even if this wasn't the case, the dex scrolls were still a more appealing choice, since they not only give the full 3 points of accuracy, but they also give avoidability, which was extremely valuable on a low avoidability melee class like Spearman. The best part? Scrolls for shoes for dex were far cheaper than scrolls for shoes for jump. The only class who wanted these scrolls was warrior, and warrior gear usually wasn't that expensive. Both archers and thieves wanted scrolls for shoes for jump, and this only helped warriors get the most accuracy they could out of their red snowshoes without breaking the bank. After the official release, warriors practically never upgraded their shoes past red snowshoes, though there was some min-maxing potential with the much higher level options. As for new releases, found deep in Elnath's mountains past the lycanthropes and werewolves were the zombie enemies, a fantastic training spot for any character over level 50, as that was the minimum requirement to enter the dungeon. Though their drops weren't special, their EXP rates were, and every single class in the game could train here effectively. 7 months passed with this second job Elnath meta before GMS would see the release of third job. A warrior's job instructor clone could be found in the Path of the Glittering Crystal located in Ant Tunnel Park. After defeating this clone, it was just a matter of passing the test of wisdom, and a spearman would become a Dragon Knight. The end of second job for a Dragon Knight was just a glimpse of the sheer power they would hold once they unlocked their full potential in third job. The first skill a Dragon Knight receives is, interestingly, a skill that magicians also receive, kind of like what we saw in first job. Elemental Resistance gives up to 40% damage reduction against elemental spell damage. This means a lot of the endgame monsters who deal elemental damage would hit far less on a Dragon Knight after this skill was acquired. Crusher, a 3-hit forced stabbing attack that hits up to 3 enemies. This skill is available for both spears and polearms, but as we learned previously, stabbing attacks are more effective with a spear than with a polearm. This skill is the reason why Dragon Knights want Spear Mastery and Booster. Dragon Fury is a 1-hit forced swinging attack that hits up to 6 enemies. Again, this skill is available for spears and polearms, but with it being a forced swinging attack, we want to be using polearms for this. This skill is the reason why Dragon Knights want Polearm Mastery and Booster. Sacrifice is the next skill a Dragon Knight receives. It's just a normal one-line attacking skill that also consumes a percentage of the damage dealt taken from the Dragon Knight's HP pool. This skill doesn't hit particularly hard, and it's not very important for now. Dragon Roar is a very iconic OSMS skill. So iconic, in fact, that it was included in the recent 19th anniversary minigame. This skill is a large AoE attacking skill, similar to something like Genesis, but it didn't hit nearly as hard, and it cost the Dragon Knight 30% of their max HP to cast in the first place. It was unable to be used if the Dragon Knight was below 50% HP, which was likely to help avoid situations where they'd cast it and immediately get hit and die. This skill had a few uses. It could aggro monsters within a large range, which was very helpful for a low mobility warrior. If the Dragon Knight was strong enough, it could straight up just kill the monsters, just like Genesis. Power Crash is the next skill on the list. This skill would simply dispel monsters who buffed themselves. It had practically no impact until post-Big Bang, where it actually dispelled the important buffs from bosses. Finally, for third job, we have Dragon Blood, a buff skill that increases weapon attack by 12 for 160 seconds, while also taking away 20 HP every 4 seconds for the duration of the buff. It sounds good on paper, and it was good during this third job era, but it wouldn't always be a good skill. As we know, the further a character gets in their progression, the less helpful it usually is to give very specific skill builds. For third job, we finally see why a hybrid build is so useful. Spear Crusher is great for dealing high amounts of damage, and the faster attacking Dragon Fury polearm is great for mobbing. Like we saw previously with Magician's Magic Claw skill, Spear Crusher doesn't increase its cost to benefit ratio linearly. From level 1 to 15, it will only hit 2 lines instead of the full 3 lines, but it will still hit all 3 enemies. Leveling it to 16 reduces the number of monsters hit down to 1 while raising the number of lines to 3. Effectively, this means leveling Spear Crusher from 15 to 16 decreases the number of lines dealt overall from 6 to 3, while only increasing the damage multiplier by a measly 4%. In this case, it's better to level Spear Crusher to 15 and then save up 11 points to immediately raise it to 26, where it will once again hit 3 enemies, this time with all 3 lines of damage. This consideration was far more important for a third job Dragon Knight than it was for a first job Magician. You don't want to have to go back to using Power Strike after all. An optimal build for a Dragon Knight kind of depends on the era of the game and the content available. If there are only high HP mobs and not a lot of gear that made everyone super powerful, the damage from Spear Crusher would usually outweigh the benefits from Dragon Fury polearm. Either way, these two skills would be the first to be maxed in any era, regardless of the order. After Spear Crusher and Dragon Fury polearm are maxed, there really are no rules. A Dragon Knight suffers a bit from a lack of choice when it comes to skill build. There are clearly defined best practices when raising a Dragon Knight that are simply not worth deviating from in any way. Ultimately, this is what a final skill build for a Dragon Knight might look like. So we now know why a hybrid Dragon Knight is so strong. They receive the most powerful form of both of their main third job attacking skills by going the hybrid route, but it does mean they need 2 weapons. Luckily, a warrior wasn't too expensive in terms of gear, but during this era, Dragon Knights were among the top 3 in terms of class popularity, so that gear wasn't exactly free. Some of the endgame mobs of the time, like Banes, Lucidas, Dark Yeti, and Pepes, all dropped weapons that were viable options for a Dragon Knight. However, the best in slot options were the Eclipse or the Blood Snowboard, which boasted a higher attack speed, and for spears, the Redemption and Omega Spear once it was released. There were no faster options for endgame spears just yet, so the highest damage option was best in slot. Not very many Dragon Knights during this time were actually going for a hybrid build. Instead, they were building pure spear skills and spamming Crusher to take down the high HP mobs. We wouldn't really see the hybrid build being popularized until FangBlade took over the rankings towards the end of the third job era, so Omega Spears and Redemptions were all you'd really ever see. Final Attack wouldn't be procced by Crusher, so a lot of players pumped points into Final Attack even though they knew it wasn't good, and just kind of went with that build because they knew they wouldn't have to deal with Final Attack after getting third job. Pure Polearm is a build that was utilized, though it was objectively inferior in terms of damage output. The motivation for this build usually came down to either a conscious avoidance of the spear meta, or simply a love for the appearance of polearms. Unlike an Axe Hero or Mace Paladin, where there was some argument for the viability of those builds, a polearm Dragon Knight would almost never beat a Spear Dragon Knight outside of grinding. A hybrid build was obviously the best since it had no downsides, so this is strictly a comparison against pure spear builds. Training for a Dragon Knight in this era without the abundance of accuracy gear and power creep or mobs that had relatively low HP was often best approached with high damaging Spear Crusher. Yeti and Pepes were a good option, Banes were common due to them holding the Omega Spear drop, Lucidas were also clearly a viable option as Tiger is demonstrating here, likely for their Eclipse drop. Once a Dragon Knight had sufficient accuracy and damage, they could participate in Bane parties, holding down a section of the map while a priest runs around delivering holy symbol to everyone. You know, I mention this all the time, but I don't actually know if it was done in real old school MapleStory. Did people do Bane parties back then? It's so insanely efficient. Once Ludibrium was released, a new best-in-slot spear came with it. There was no additional polearm release, even though the Eviscerator was in the files. This weapon actually has a very interesting story behind it, but we'll discuss that some other time. If you played MapleStory at any point, you've likely seen the Fair Frozen being wielded by Tiger and all the other Dragon Knights underneath him. It has a cool aesthetic, no pun intended, and it dropped exclusively from Thanatos at this time. There was no attack speed difference between the Fair Frozen and the Omega Spear, just an increase in weapon attack. Of course, this was also the era of deep looty priest and Dragon Knight farming, a story I've told countless times now, but let's tell it one last time. The synergy between these two classes was unlike anything this game has ever conceived in my opinion. It's no secret that I hold this era in very high regard, and it's my favorite meta that GMS has ever seen. A Dragon Knight's role in this duo scenario was very simple. Deal damage, kill the enemies, and provide hyper body, which contributed to a priest's ability to stay alive and potentially avoid using Magic Guard with their increased HP pool, allowing them to tank hits from these powerful monsters. As we know, not using Magic Guard resulted in potions saved for the priest. A priest's role in this duo was to provide Holy Symbol, which substantially increased EXP in a party of 2. They were also responsible for healing the Dragon Knight, whose HP pool was so large that they could tank multiple hits without any fear of dying, though the presence of unlimited heals from the priest meant they were practically never using an HP potion. With MP Eater, a priest's MP potion consumption would be reduced as well, as long as the duo was farming at monsters who were undead, which was often the case. With Dragon Knights offering so much to a priest, giving them some of the best EXP rates available, Dragon Knights were in turn favored by the priests, and this gave them some of the best EXP rates available since they had unlimited heals, Mystic Door, and Holy Symbol. Dragon Knights, and to a lesser degree all warriors, were the best farmers during this era, primarily because of their damage and their priest partners. Version 23, the release of Zachem and the first anniversary of GMS that brought the level 35 and 43 Maple weapons. Dexless warriors were kind of already a thing at this point. People were already trying their hardest to keep their dex down there at 4. There was no real moment where dexless builds were unlocked within the meta when it comes to warriors, but if there was anything that helped their cause, it was the release of these Maple weapons. Since they were only level 43, they weren't really viable for endgame. There was no way a level 43 spear could beat a Fair Frozen. It just wouldn't happen, even with the increased attack speed, which was still a minor weakness Dragon Knights had. The extra accuracy mostly came in handy for the low-level players who didn't have access to a lot of good gear. These weapons primarily just raised the damage floor of low-level spearmen. With Zachem, we saw for the first time the role a Dragon Knight would hold in bosses. Their damage was decent, good even, with a strong spear, lots of strength, and crusher. What most people really wanted from a Dragon Knight, though, was hyper body. Not every class had a comfortable time in Zachem, but a Dragon Knight was basically unkillable. By level 150, their HP pool would be so large that Zachem's damage output would be of no threat to them. Other classes, however, weren't quite so unkillable. Squishy archers and thieves would benefit the most from hyperbody, and a Dragon Knight, much like a priest, was almost always guaranteed a spot in a boss run because of this skill. The Zachem helmet was incredibly valuable for endgame Dragon Knights. It gave strength and dex, and it had a built-in accuracy increase, up to a maximum of plus 23 on a good roll. A perfectly rolled Zachem helmet scrolled with entirely 10% helmet dex scrolls would give a grand total of plus 60 accuracy. Obviously unreasonable to acquire, but a Zachem helmet was a huge increase in accuracy, whether it was perfect or not, and this wouldn't be the last time we saw an item like this being released that would once again make all warriors much more powerful by giving them more accuracy to work with. The Deep Gorge maps were released in version 28. Dragon Knights were no longer relegated to the Lost Time maps in Deep Ludibrium. Gobies were easier and faster than Grim Phantom Watches, though their drops weren't that great. A Dragon Knight had no trouble hitting these mobs, who were lower level than what they were previously used to training on, and their high damage output meant their spears would cleave through these enemies like a hot knife through butter. Priests would follow the Dragon Knight to this new meta training spot, even though the Gobies weren't undead. The increase in EXP was more than worth it. It was also around this time that the red surfboard was added to the game, a 7 attack speed level 95 polearm that also gave +5 speed, and it dropped from bonefish and squids, both of whom were being killed constantly. This weapon was difficult to beat, partially because of its widespread availability, and it held status as one of the best polearms for practically the rest of the game as far as Dragon Knights were concerned. Version 40 was the release of New Leaf City. Not only are the overpowered potions brought to us in GMS with this update, but we also saw the release of wolf spiders, a mob we haven't had much of a chance to discuss since none of the classes we've covered yet have been able to grind there. Wolf spiders had a great HP to EXP ratio, but they hit hard, moved fast, and had pretty high HP overall. These are things that a warrior does not particularly care about, especially a tanky Dragon Knight. Wolf spiders couldn't replace Gobies entirely, but they did drop Dark Scrolls for polearms and spears, as well as Ilby throwing stars that could be sold to hermits. Dragon Knights were one of the best classes to take on wolf spiders, and they would serve as a great grinding spot for a huge level range. With how concentrated these mobs were and the rising dominance of the hybrid build, I would say that wolf spider grinding was the first time we saw polearms really beat out spears in terms of popularity until the higher levels where spears still reigned supreme. But the update that killed the pure spear build entirely was version 41, where Mushroom Shrine was expanded to include Encounter with the Buddha, a map consisting entirely of Hime's and the Black Crow area boss, who had a respawn time of around 23 hours. Hime's replaced Gobies as the best grinding spot for a Dragon Knight, and because of their relatively low HP, lack of the bombing fish house that had to be taken down before the squishy Gobies were accessible, and the map they were found on being entirely flat, Dragon Fury Polearm absolutely destroyed Spear Crusher in terms of EXP gains on this map. This was around the time that FangBlade, wielding his surfboard, overtook Tiger on the rankings, and a lot of this had to do with his quick adoption of the hybrid build. Tiger reigned supreme primarily during the era of Spear Crusher dominance that arose almost entirely out of necessity. There were few best-in-slot accuracy-increasing items, power creep hadn't made everyone so much stronger, and Spear Crusher was a necessity to output the damage required to kill the endgame monsters at any sort of acceptable rate. By the end of this era, though, we'd see the release of 4th Job, which included a massive meta shift for Dragon Knights in both mobbing and bossing. After reaching level 120, Togain is eligible to job advance. Dragon Knights, provided they had the accuracy, were one of the few classes who could comfortably take on Manon and Griffey to get the materials for 4th Job. After defeating these area bosses and talking to Harmonia in Forest of the Priest, Togain becomes a Dark Knight. Maple Warrior, a party buff that increases all stats by up to 10%. The quirk that this skill had of only increasing base stats and not counting stats added from gear was relevant for a Dark Knight, but it didn't need to be in order to encourage the Dexless build. There was already more than enough incentive for all warriors to try their hardest to reach 4 Dex. Hero's Will, we've talked about this before, it cures the seduction status that Horntail inflicted and has a long cooldown. Now we reach the first warrior common skill that Dark Knights received. Monster Magnet will pull a monster towards the player at a set success rate, 95% at max level. This skill existed to alleviate some of the mobility issues that Dark Knights had. Power Stance is another warrior common skill and the first iteration of the stance status that we find in modern MapleStory. Only warriors were given this luxury back in the day, and again it was to help with their mobility issues. They had to be up close and personal to deal damage, so if they were constantly getting knocked out of their melee range, they'd quickly be overshadowed by ranged classes in terms of DPS, which implies that they weren't already, but that's a different discussion. Yet another warrior common skill. Rush would allow the Dark Knights to dash forward very quickly, taking any enemies in their path with them. This skill had a short cooldown, so it couldn't be spammed, and it would only move the player forward if there were actually enemies to be hit. Achilles is yet another warrior common skill. It's very straightforward. When maxed, all damage taken is reduced by 15%. Dragon Knights already rarely had issues with survivability. Achilles just helped them become even more powerful tanks. It's about time we reach a skill that wasn't found on other classes. Berserk is a passive skill that activates when the player is under a certain HP threshold. At max level in its first iteration, this HP threshold was 40%. When at 40% HP or lower, the Dark Knight's damage across the board would be doubled. They'd also have this really cool Dragonhorn effect that pulsed every so often. This skill would eventually be buffed to having a 50% HP threshold before the end of the pre-Big Bang era. Beholder is a little bit complex. Beholder itself is a summon that follows around the Dark Knight and permanently increases weapon mastery by 20%, which gives the Dark Knight more stable damage than either a paladin or a hero. There were two sub-skills that Beholder would cast, Aura of the Beholder and Hex of the Beholder. Aura of the Beholder is a skill that Beholder will use while it's summoned, and it recovers 500 HP every 4 seconds. Hex of the Beholder is a buff skill that Beholder will use that increases a bunch of stats, including weapon attack. Compared to other classes, Dark Knights have a bit more of a specific direction they want to go for their early 4th job skill build. For building a Dark Knight, 1 point is added to Rush for mobility, and Beholder is maxed first for the increase in mastery. Berserk is maxed next for the increase in damage, followed by Stance, and then Maple Warrior. Everything else is leveled as necessary. The most impactful skill a Dark Knight receives is Berserk. It straight up doubled their damage output and added complexity to a class in a game not known for having complex mechanics. In its initial implementation, where the HP threshold was 40% or less, this effectively limited a Dark Knight's HP pool to just 12,000 total, assuming they were able to reach the cap of 30,000, which was reasonably obtainable with some light HP washing for a Dark Knight. This restriction meant that they were unable to continue using the elixirs, power elixirs, and honsters that they had become accustomed to using. Berserk forced Dark Knights to return to using primarily melting cheese and reindeer milk to recover their HP, while also staying below the Berserk threshold. As we know, these potions weren't cheap, so Dark Knights were forced to use more expensive potions to utilize a mechanic that was dangerous and difficult to adjust to. Most Dark Knights were able to overcome this hurdle of learning to use Berserk, and the ones that didn't would stop playing Dark Knight. Berserk is a really cool skill conceptually. Even in practice, it's still an engaging mechanic, but it asked a lot more of Dark Knights than the game did of basically any other class except for Corsair's battleship mechanics. Whether Wizit and Nexon were already heading this direction with the class by the time they started designing 3rd Job, we don't really know, but Dark Knight is an interesting mix of flashy, engaging, and admittedly over-engineered. Their 3rd Job kit, primarily Sacrifice and Dragon Roar, are fantastic tools for manipulating their HP to stay within Berserk range. Their skills are cool, the visual effect from Berserk is awesome to look at, but the design overall is a bit of a deviation from the design of Dragon Knight. In all honesty, it's a complete 180 from the tanky, high HP Priest partner that they had been up until now. Of course, Priests also received a major change with 4th Job, as we know, and Dark Knights did get a huge damage increase with Berserk. They were still great at farming, great at bossing, though Berserk added a lot of complexity to Dark Knights, and now that Bishops were doing most of the farming, Dark Knights took a back seat, killing off anything the Bishop missed. The release of Leafree with 4th Job also brought mounts into the game for the first time ever. They haven't been relevant yet on our journey through exploring every class in OSMS, since both Nightlords and Bishops had insanely good mobility already. Dark Knights wanted the level 120 mount, the Silver Mane, as soon as humanly possible. This meant shelling out the 20 million mesos for the level 70 Hog mount, and then procuring the materials and mesos required for the upgraded Silver Mane, which didn't come easily. This mount had very high movement speed, and along with Rush, it would allow Dark Knights to zoom around the map nearly as efficiently as just about any other class. No more brisk walks to every single destination. By level 200, which FangBlade reached shortly after the release of 4th Job, the Red Draco mount would be available, and this mount was truly the mark of a powerful endgame player in this era. Eventually, enough items were released in GMS that Dragon Knights no longer had to worry too much about their accuracy, and they could instead begin building gear purely for damage. This is the kind of setup an endgame Dragon Knight might be rocking. Again, we see the attacking class opting for a Mark of Narracane over a Horntail pendant, due to both the extra weapon attack and the added accuracy. Face and eye accessories were another massive source of accuracy for warriors. Get some of these, scroll them for accuracy, and you can see how the need for accuracy slowly diminished over time. The big thing that separates a lot of Dark Knight gear from something like a Night Lord is the lack of any secondary stat. Yes, accuracy was very important, but nearly every piece of gear would be scrolled for strength, and otherwise scrolled for dex only if there was no strength scroll available for that item slot. Chaos scrolls were heavily utilized on the pieces of gear that could give weapon attack, and you might notice something a bit off about the weapon choice. Endgame weapons for a Dark Knight would be dictated by just one consideration: how much attack speed versus attack power does it have? Because of this, weapons as low as level 45 would even be a part of the conversation, though ultimately this fishing pole wasn't actually able to compete with the true endgame options, of which there was effectively only one: the Sky Skis. This level 85 spear would absolutely crush any other option after its release in version 37, though it would only rise to prominence after the introduction of 4th Job and a Dark Knight's return to using Spear Crusher to grind. What separates this weapon from any other spear is simply its 6 attack speed. There's a lot of math we could get into here to determine what's better, but for the most part, a decent Sky Ski is going to beat even the best of the best endgame spears that were added before Big Bang, and when we talk about perfect weapons, the Sky Ski still comes out on top. Other spears could come close, nearly reaching the level of this powerful skiing equipment, and we're talking a difference of 5 to 10% damage usually, which, for an in-game character in an MMO, is a significant number. On a personal level, the dominance of Sky Skis used to disappoint me. I think spears and pole arms are some of the coolest looking weapons in the game, and the fact that the best in slot options for both weapon types used by my favorite class are silly, fun weapons that don't even give the appearance of taking themselves seriously used to be annoying. Looking at it nowadays though, I find it kind of charming. The attack speed difference between a Sky Ski and a Dragon Faltazin, for example, could be felt when using Spear Crusher, so I'll let it slide. Sky Skis are cool with me, even if I prefer they didn't exist. In version 62, pirates were released. Buccaneers specifically had a party buff that was invaluable for a Dark Knight, and it boosted their damage output significantly by increasing their attack speed another 2 levels. Speed infusion might be the most impactful on a Dark Knight compared to any other class. Maybe a hero or paladin comes close. With speed infusion, a pair of Sky Skis could get all the way down to the attack speed cap of 2, which was absolutely unheard of for a spear. Though, Archer's Sharp Eyes also increases a Dark Knight's damage by a huge amount, even beating out speed infusion's impact in terms of DPS, surprisingly. The biggest overall changes for a Dark Knight as the game was updated pre-Big Bang were the Berserk HP threshold increase to 50%, as well as the numerous items that were added that increased accuracy. Common training areas generally remained the same throughout the rest of OSMS, but the addition of Forest of Golem was massively impactful for a mid-level spearman and low-level Dragon Knights. The layout of this map was very friendly to melee characters, and golems were large and slow-moving, perfect targets for Slash Blast. As a Dragon Knight slowly leveled their 3rd Job mobbing skills, they could stay here and continue to get good EXP rates until roughly the early 80s, where it started to fall off. Forest of Golem might be the single best training spot for melee characters in the mid-pre-Big Bang era. Later additions like Gallipharas, CDs, Ghost Ship enemies, Himes, etc. gave Dark Knights powerful training spots throughout their whole career. Even towards the end of the pre-Big Bang era, the addition of Temple of Time added great endgame training spots that Dark Knights were actually able to take great advantage of, unlike the classes we've covered so far. Sky Skis were pretty much always best in slot due to their attack speed, and they wouldn't really be replaced until after Big Bang, once systems were overhauled and normal spears started to return within the meta. Eventually, Dragon Knight, Dark Knight's third job advancement, would be completely removed from the game, in both the literal sense and by having their original dragon theming removed completely. Their identity with Crusher, Dragon Fury, and Dragon Roar would eventually be stripped from them to be replaced with their new theme of edgy darkness. If anything, this helped solidify Dragon Knight's legacy even further by disallowing further writing of its story. In my mind, Dragon Knight is its own creature, and Dark Knight is kind of something else entirely. Kaiser made for a great Dragon Knight replacement, but we'll discuss that class some other time. Dark Knight's kit, being over-engineered and difficult to master, results in a class that is not only fun and satisfying to play, but also performs really well in a lot of content. With their high HP pool, they were able to participate in pretty much any content that was made available. Even when they still had a 40% Berserk HP threshold, which we know was eventually changed to be 50%, they still had a base HP pool of 12,000, which is way higher than any other non-warrior class. Yes, they were less tanky than other warriors, but they had Crusher, which could hit up to 3 enemies. This multi-target attack would be hugely beneficial in CWKPQ, Zakum, and even Horntail, depending on the stage of the fight. Dark Knights were mandatory for Pink Bean runs since they provided the very important Hyper Body that helped squishy classes stay alive. In mobbing, their mobility with a mount and their mob control between Rush, Crusher, and Monster Magnet made them very high tier in that regard, and they were welcome training partners for a variety of classes. A Dark Knight's role was pretty set in stone. We would have to try harder and be more attentive in boss fights, but our reward was greater than any: recognition and respect from our peers, as well as often outperforming other melee attackers. On a personal level, the shift from third job to fourth job was kind of a disappointment for me. I really liked Dragon Knight, but after taking this hour-long look at Dark Knight and really rediscovering the class, my love for Dark Knight has been revived. You could go hero, which is a fine option, but a hero will never have the skill ceiling a Dark Knight requires to perform well. A Night Lord, for example, might have more damage, but that's all they'll ever provide to the party. They can't help Bowmasters survive just by being present. In a world where min-maxing wasn't the entire point of the game, and the only goal was to have fun and play the class you loved, this difference in damage output didn't matter one bit. Given the opportunity, I would play Dark Knight over any other class in old school MapleStory. Thanks for watching. Before we end this video, I want to give a quick shout out to my supporters on Patreon and YouTube. In the big tier, we have Jerry L, Anonymous, and Andy D. Thank you guys so much. That's so generous. I really do appreciate it. In the Togain tier, we have Remix My Life, Velarex, Tiago N, Gummy Bullet, Filamentus, Big Buddy, Connor H, R, Stuck in a Well, Supreme Q, Michael S, Gus, Adane P, and Juggy Bear. Thank you guys so much. I also want to say thanks to the anonymous $250 donation I received earlier this month. That is crazy. I cannot believe that. But thank you very, very much. If you want to support me, there are multiple ways to do so, and you can find links to the various methods in the description of this video. You'll receive a special role in my Discord server, access to my video schedule and future plans, as well as my eternal thanks for allowing me to do what I love.